1 minute can decide the outcome of a battle. An hour can decide the outcome of a battle. And a day can decide the fate of an empire.
Not long after, a voice came through the walkie-talkie in Morgan's hands. It was Vulture's.
Mr. Morgan, if I pull my men out, can you assure me that you won't pursue this matter?
Without hesitation, Morgan responded decisively.
Take your men and leave. Tell me who hired you, and I can act as if this never happened. You have my word.
The man who contacted me is an Ethiopian called Galong, but he's from the newer tribe. After we reached South Sudan, we joined forces with a newer battalion part of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, led by a commander named Pup. There are 76 men, but I believe they come from 3 different tribes. That's all I know.
Morgan pondered for a moment before nodding and picking up the walkie-talkie again.
All right, you're free to leave. I'll let bygones be bygones. But you killed people from National Geographic, and if the U.S. government troubles you about it, that's not on me.
Vulture, in a panicked voice.
Those damn fools. My God, I'm finished because of those idiots. Mr. Morgan, it was the newer people who killed those from National Geographic. We hadn't even confirmed the target, and those idiots rushed in, killing on sight. Okay, Mr. Morgan, I understand this is still partly my fault, and I just have to accept my bad luck. Nevertheless, I'm not afraid of the US government, I only care about your stance. As long as you don't pursue it, I'm not afraid. Alright, I'm pulling out now.
After Vulture finished speaking, it wasn't long before the drone that had been circling above descended rapidly, wobbled its wings, and flew past overhead before heading straight away. And just after the drone had flown off, Vulture provided Morgan with coordinates over the walkie-talkie, the current location of the newer. Morgan entered the coordinates into his GPS and discovered that they were over 30 kilometers away in a straight line, a distance at which the newer couldn't pose any threat. Without the support of Vulture's mercenaries or aerial reconnaissance, the newer would have no way to locate them. Although still cautious, the team felt considerably more at ease. After sharing this good news with Professor Bark and the rest, they resumed their journey with lighter hearts. Back on the road, Gao Yang's mood was buoyant. Reaching Malakal meant safety. Now that he could relax, Gao Yang finally took the opportunity to inquire about their current situation. It was February 16, 2011, and Gao Yang had arrived in Ethiopia on a day in July 2008. Approximately 3 years had passed since that time. Through Professor Bark's analysis, Gao Yang had gained a rough understanding of what had transpired since his plane crash. The aircraft he had been on likely plunged into the Blue Nile flowing into Ethiopia. Gao Yang was carried by the river into Sudanese territory, where he landed on the west bank of the Blue Nile. After reaching Sudan, Gao Yang followed the migrations of the Akuri tribe and slowly made his way to the plains between the White and Blue Niles, an area of frequent conflict between North and South Sudan. Although large-scale civil war had ceased in Sudan, small skirmishes had never truly ended. This year, on January 9, 2011, South Sudan confirmed its separation from the North through a referendum, meaning a new war could break out at any moment. National Geographic wanted to seize the rare period of peace to film a documentary about wildlife and hired the renowned zoologist and naturalist Professor Bark for the project. Tragically, they became unwittingly involved in a disaster. In the team dispatched by National Geographic, 2 individuals were killed by the attackers, with the remaining 14 casualties being guides and guards hired in Sudan. Of course, had it not been for Professor Bark's rescue alongside Gao Yang, the entire National Geographic crew would have been massacred. Thus, in saving others, Professor Bark and his team saved themselves. Catherine, the only woman in the party, was a student of Professor Bark. Despite being female, she was deeply passionate about filming and protecting wild animals and had committed herself to this cause. After much pleading with Professor Bark, she had finally been allowed to accompany him to Sudan. With the explanations from Professor Bark and the others, many of Gao Yang's questions were finally answered. No wonder he had encountered gunfire soon after emerging from the river, and no surprise that his plane had crashed in Ethiopia, yet he ended up in Sudan, living there for a long while without encountering anyone from the civilized world. Now, their destination was Malakal, a city in southern Sudan, but still under Khartoum's control, with a substantial military presence. Once inside Malakal, they would be safe, although the outskirts were active areas for the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, necessitating caution. As for Sudan, Gao Yang was just a passerby. He held no concern for the country's fate. His only worry was for the Akuri tribe. Since warfare was anticipated by Professor Bark and others, and the conflict zone wasn't far from where the Akuri currently resided, safety was a concern. The one piece of good news was the Akuri's remote location, which meant they would likely escape the war's impact. Should they stay alert and retreat to the southern rainforest if danger approached, they should be safe. As time passed, Gao Yang and his companions approached Malakal without incident. Finally, they reached a bumpy dirt road flanked by fields and mud and straw huts, with people carrying AK rifles often seen traveling along. These individuals stepped aside to let their speeding vehicle pass, observing them with indifferent gazes. When dusk fell, they finally arrived at the outskirts of Malakal. Having come this far without being shot at, and without having to meet up with reinforcements from the Dinka tribe, they had rushed through, avoiding all contacts. Upon reaching the city's edge, they could consider themselves safe. Here, Morgan stopped the vehicle and instructed Gao Yang to hand over the guns since carrying them into Malakal might cause trouble. Handing them over to Morgan seemed the best way to avoid any issues. Gao Yang wasn't a killer. He only wielded a gun for self-defense. Now that they had reached Malakal, whether he was armed or not mattered little. His primary wish was to leave this place without further ado, a desire not to endure another ordeal where survival depended on fighting through a bloodbath. After passing 2 checkpoints with Morgan leading the way, Gao Yang and his group easily entered Malakal and went directly to the city's largest hotel. Malakal is a major city at the junction of North and South Sudan, but compared to its outskirts, the difference lies only in the denser housing. As Gao Yang traveled, he didn't come across any particularly tall buildings. Upon arrival in the busiest area of Malakal, things looked somewhat better as small buildings sporadically began to appear on the street sides, giving some semblance of an urban landscape. When they finally reached their lodging, a hotel, a white man waiting at the entrance greeted them. Before the car had even come to a stop, he approached Morgan's vehicle, opened the door, and with apparent concern said,
"Thank God you are back safe. I have already booked the rooms. Please follow me."
Morgan stepped out of the car and nodded to the greeter before approaching the vehicle Gao Yang was in.
Gentlemen, we have arrived. Those of you without pressing matters can rest now. However, I suppose Professor Bark would need to meet with the mayor and the police right away.
Professor Bark.
Correct. The bodies of my people are still out on the grassland. If possible, I would like to go back tonight to look for them.
Gao Yang doubted whether Professor Bark would manage to find the bodies of the victims. Nearly 2 whole days and a night had passed, enough time for the vultures and hyenas of the plains to leave nothing behind, not even the bones.
I am willing to offer whatever help I can. You can go to the police station with my men. The mayor is already waiting there. The local military commander is also present. This could save you some time, and you might even be able to leave tonight. You can also get in touch with the embassy there. Surely, by tomorrow, someone from the embassy will come to deal with this matter.
Professor Bark nodded rapidly, understanding that without Morgan's help, he would be lucky to even see the mayor by the next day, let alone dispatch a search party for the victims anytime soon. Professor Bark gratefully shaking hands with Morgan.
I can't thank you enough for your help.
Morgan shaking his head.
This all started because of me. I do these things to ease my own conscience. Professor, I'll be leaving soon, possibly tonight, so if you need anything else, just ask.
Professor Bark, looking at Gao Yang.
Mr. Morgan, our mutual friend Gao Yang is very eager to get home. I was planning to assist him with his return, but as you know, we are bound to stay here for some time. With the matters here unresolved, we cannot leave. Could you perhaps help him?
Mr. Morgan smiled at Gao Yang and said,
I was just about to offer. It seems we had the same thought. I, too, believe it's best for Mr. Gao Yang to leave as soon as possible. After all, he has killed many men. Professor, when you negotiate with the government and our dear embassy, please don't bring up Gao Yang's name to avoid trouble for him. Don't you agree?
Professor Bark nodded seriously and responded,
I am well aware of the gravity of the situation. I won't mention him. And our people have agreed on the same story. We won't cause any trouble for Gao Yang, don't worry.
Morgan summoned the white man who had opened his car door to come over and said, Morgan to Professor Bark, pointing at the white man.
"Professor, this is my man. Just give him a shout when you're ready, and he will stay with you to provide assistance. I won't join you, as it's inconvenient for me to show up. And Bob's injuries should be tended to immediately, so I'll be leaving directly once the plane arrives.
After speaking, Morgan turned to Gao Yang.
Now, you should take a bath, change into some clothes, and then wait to board the plane with me. We are heading to Libya next, and personally, I strongly advise you to leave this place as soon as possible. Of course, I am asking for your opinion. The decision is yours to make.
Morgan then turned to Professor Bark, who furrowed his brows and inquired. Professor Bark.
Mr. Morgan, if I may be so bold, it seems that Libya is not exactly peaceful right now. Why would you want to go there at this time?
Morgan, with a shrug, resignedly.
You know, in our line of work, it's best to stay ahead of others. Precisely because Libya is about to descend into chaos, I must rush over there. Business is tough nowadays. I have to seize every opportunity to earn. According to the latest news I've got, Libya is already in turmoil, and civil war seems inevitable, so I need to beat the clock. Of course, for Gao Yang, staying here or going to Libya isn't the best option, so he needs to make a choice.
Both Morgan and Bark looked at Gao Yang, who hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. He was unaware of the chaos in Libya, but clearly Malakal was not a safe haven either, especially since he was keen to avoid any interaction with the local police or military. Gao Yang didn't want to wait a moment longer. He just wanted to get home as soon as possible. After pondering briefly, he quickly made up his mind.
I will go to Libya with Mr. Morgan. This way, I can return home faster.
Professor Bark nodded, stepped forward to embrace Gao Yang, and then scribbled a line on a notepad before tearing out the page and handing it to Gao Yang.
I don't have time to see you off. This is my contact information in the States. After you get home, please give me a call. We're friends now, aren't we?
Gao Yang with a smile.
Of course, we're friends. I will call you as soon as I get back. We'll have plenty of opportunities to meet in the future, under much safer circumstances.
Morgan clapped his hands.
All right, we have plenty of time for goodbyes. Let's go into the hotel now.
Professor Bark.
You go ahead and take your time talking at the hotel. I need to head to the police station now.
After Professor Bark and Morgan's man left, Gao Yang and the others went into the hotel. The two bodies in Mr. Morgan's vehicle were securely wrapped in body bags, prepared to be flown away with the plane. From this gesture, Gao Yang felt that Morgan must be rather good to his men. Anyone willing to go through such trouble to bring back the bodies of his subordinates would likely treat the living no less decently. Upon entering the hotel room, Gao Yang found it neatly prepared, complete with the rare luxury of an air conditioner. Although he had adapted to the nearly 40-degree heat during the dry season, the coolness was still a welcome pleasure. After a refreshing shower, Gao Yang's first proper wash in 3 years, 2 hours had gone by. He changed into the clothes Bob had given him, which fit reasonably well apart from being a little loose. It had been 3 years since he last wore clothes, making the experience feel quite unfamiliar, although not uncomfortable. Bob didn't have spare shoes to offer, only a few pairs of socks, so Gao Yang resumed wearing the boots he hadn't changed for 3 years. He didn't wish to discard those Dana military boots. Their quality was undeniable. After over 3 years, aside from some minor scuffs and a grimy appearance, his boots were problem-free. More importantly, Gao Yang had grown attached to them. Even if he wouldn't wear them again, he intended to keep the boots as a memento. While Gao Yang was attempting to clean his near-putrid boots, Catherine knocked and entered his room. She was momentarily stunned upon seeing Gao Yang, then smiled.
You are wearing clothes. I almost didn't recognize you. You look different than I imagined.
Gao Yang shrugging.
That's an easy misunderstanding. It's as if I never wore clothes before. I actually did wear clothes.
Catherine.
Okay, if you count a grass skirt as clothing, my apologies for the mistake. I came by to give you this.
She handed Gao Yang a note, which he carefully read. It contained Catherine's residential phone number and a series of contact methods online. He cautiously placed the note in his pocket, chuckling. Gao Yang.
I'll keep it safe, and I'll call you after I return.
After saying this, Gao Yang felt at a loss for words when faced with Catherine. He wanted to say something but couldn't find the appropriate words, leading to an awkward silence. Catherine laughed softly.
Aren't you going to invite me to sit down?
As if waking from a dream, Gao Yang promptly invited her.
Please, have a seat.
At that moment, Catherine burst out laughing.
Your performance right now is quite clumsy. I bet you've never had a girlfriend.
Gao Yang scratching his head, embarrassed.
First, I didn't want one, then I had no chance. So not only do I have no girlfriend, I haven't even had my first kiss, ha.
After saying that, Gao Yang instantly regretted it, wondering what had made him spill such personal information. To his astonishment, Catherine looked him in the eye for a moment before suddenly leaning in, her hands on his shoulders, and pressed her alluring red lips against his. Feeling the warmth on his lips, Gao Yang's mind went blank. This indeed was his first kiss. But just as he was about to savor the experience, the door swung open, and Bob barged in shouting.
Hey, bro, the plane's arrived ahead of schedule. We need to head out now. Whoa, sorry, I'll leave right away.
But it was too late. At the sound of Bob's voice, Catherine had already pulled back from the brief kiss. Seeing Gao Yang's fiery gaze, Bob stammered apologetically.
I'm sorry, really sorry, truly very sorry. I'll leave now. Hey, we can delay the takeoff a bit, no problem.
Catherine ignored Bob, instead offering Gao Yang a gentle smile and a slight pout of her lips, whispering,
I apologize for stealing your first kiss, but it seems it was not as sensational as one might expect, different from what I had imagined. Well, I hope you don't misconstrue this. In fairy tales, isn't the princess supposed to give her first kiss to the brave knight who saves her? So, I'm not pursuing you. I just wanted to show my gratitude. Plus, now we're even with both our first kisses accounted for. So, with that, the farewell ceremony comes to an end. Goodbye.
The airport in Malakal was quite small and there were no flights at night except for the plane that had come to pick up Morgan, which was parked on the runway. Gao Yang and the others drove their car right up beside the aircraft, where 3 people who had arrived with the plane were standing by the cabin door. Getting out of the car, Morgan walked over to one of the individuals waiting by the plane and embraced him, then spoke in a low voice.
Your brother's body is in the car. I'm sorry, Simon.
Simon nodded, his voice heavy.
Mr. Morgan, Moses simply did his duty. Thank you very much for bringing him home.
Morgan patted Simon on the shoulder, nodded at the other 2 people, and then signaled Bob and Gao Yang to follow him quickly onto the plane. The plane waiting to pick up Morgan was a beautiful Gulfstream G450, a private jet that could conduct intercontinental flights. Though Gao Yang didn't know how much such a plane would cost, he understood it must be extremely valuable. There were 19 seats in the cabin. After telling Gao Yang to make himself comfortable, Morgan went to the front of the cabin to start a quiet conversation with his welcoming party. Gao Yang, being self-aware, took a seat as far from Morgan as possible. Seeing Gao Yang sitting in the corner, Bob, with a playful smirk, took the seat next to him and nudged him with his elbow.
Hey, buddy, you're not still mad at me, are you? Okay, I apologize again. I swear I won't ruin things for you next time.
Gao Yang shook his head and said softly,
I'm not mad. I'm just scared, man. I'm terrified right now.
Bob, puzzled.
Scared? Of what? Do you have a phobia of flying?
Gao Yang let out a bitter laugh.
No, it's just that the thought of going home now terrifies me. I've been away for too long, and I have no idea what's happened at home. We have a saying in China, the nearer home, the greater the panic. I think that's what I'm feeling.
That's a strange idea. There's nothing to be scared about going home. If I were you, I wouldn't have contacted anyone and just surprised them instead. Come on, we're about to leave this damned country. You should be happy.
While Gao Yang and Bob were talking, the plane was getting ready to take off. As soon as the one named Simon boarded, the aircraft began to shut its doors in preparation for departure. After boarding, Simon didn't immediately sit down but walked straight to Gao Yang and extended his hand. As Gao Yang took it, Simon, with a slightly hoarse voice, said,
My name is Simon, Moses' brother. I'm here to thank you for completing the duty my brother couldn't finish, for protecting Mr. Morgan, and also for helping bring my brother's body back. Thank you very much, young man.
After saying this, Simon went to sit down next to Morgan. Once he took his seat, the aircraft began to taxi. Gao Yang knew that Simon's brother was Morgan's bodyguard, Moses, a remarkably capable man. Gao Yang noticed that although Simon looked like an ordinary person who would not stand out in a crowd, the calluses on the base of his thumbs revealed a lot about him. Simon was definitely formidable. As the plane took off, Gao Yang, in a lowered voice, said to Bob sitting next to him,
Is this Simon also one of your dad's bodyguards? He seems quite formidable. What's his background?
Bob speaking quietly, cautiously.
You're right, he is incredibly good. Just like his brother, he's one of the most skilled among my dad's men. One brother usually stays close to my dad, and the other was back home. They are both Jewish, came from Israel, apparently from the same military unit. But they wouldn't share which unit, no one knows, not even my dad. I suspect they might be associated with Mossad, but that's just a guess. That's all I know.
Hearing that Simon was from Israel spiked Gao Yang's interest tremendously, not for any particular reason other than the reputation and mystery surrounding Israel's Special Forces units. Israel's Special Forces are known to have achieved some of the most impressive military feats to date, yet to this day, the names of these units have not been disclosed. Even the one known unit, Sayeret Matkal, is just speculation with no official confirmation from Israel. As a military enthusiast, Gao Yang found the Israeli Special Forces incredibly fascinating, which in turn made him very interested in Simon. But that was the extent of it. Gao Yang was not foolish enough to ask Simon about his unit or to act like a fan chasing a celebrity's signature. He simply gave Simon a few respectful, curious glances. Noticing Gao Yang's gaze fixed on Simon, Bob gave him a light nudge and whispered,
Hey, brother, stop staring at Simon and tell me about you. Your Chinese special forces are as mysterious as Israel's. Tell me a bit about them. I won't tell anyone.
Gao Yang, amused and helpless.
Where did you get the idea that I'm from the Special Forces? I told you, I'm just a military enthusiast, that's all.
Bob, dismissive.
Come on, man, I'm a military enthusiast too. Okay, maybe it's more about military hardware for me, but I still am. Do you think I could have survived under those circumstances? Moses was tough and he died. Are you still claiming to be just a military enthusiast? Don't kid me, you must be someone on a special mission, right?
Gao Yang sighing.
I am truly just a military enthusiast, not Special Forces, not a spy. I just practiced professional shooting for 3 years. The reason I managed to perform decently was that I happened to do the right thing at the right place, nothing more. Of course, the main reason was I was very, very lucky. My luck was so good that bullets just seemed to miss me. That's the only explanation I have.
Bob.
Really?
Gao Yang.
Really, I swear to heaven.
Bob, sighingly disappointed.
All right, I believe you. By the way, I've got something for you.
After saying this, Bob took off the gun holster from his waist and handed it to Gao Yang.
For you, my favorite gun, the best companion for a hunter.
Gao Yang took the holster and drew out a large, shiny, silver revolver. The gun was a Smith & Wesson Model 686, a classic from the Smith & Wesson Company known for firing .357 Magnum bullets with immense power capable of killing fierce beasts like bears and lions. The M686 could hold 7 rounds, which is more than most high-caliber revolvers. Although the M686's significant recoil and size prevent it from becoming a mainstream personal defense weapon, the revolver's reliability, the .357 Magnum's power, combined with its safety without the need for an external safety and the ability to fire immediately upon drawing, make the M686 a favorite among hunters. Bob's M686 had a 6-inch barrel, not even the largest model available, and felt heavy and substantial in Gao Yang's hands. This was his first time handling a revolver, and both its appearance and feel captivated Gao Yang. Bob's M686 had a chrome finish and ivory grip panels indicating it was yet another custom-made piece. After admiring the gun for a while, Gao Yang sighed and handed it back to Bob, a look of resignation on his face.
Forget it, better to give it back to you. I'm going to my country soon, and there's no way I can take it there.
When they arrived in Benghazi, it was the early hours of the morning. Stepping off the plane, Gao Yang felt a chill and couldn't help shivering. The temperature in Benghazi during January was around the teens, but it dropped to about 10 degrees at dawn. Having become accustomed to the high temperatures of the Sudanese plains, Gao Yang found the 10-degree weather rather cold. After settling into a genuinely comfortable hotel, Gao Yang could finally lie down on a real bed and have a good sleep. However, he didn't get to rest long. Around noon, Bob invited him to Morgan's room. Seeing Morgan, Gao Yang thought he didn't look like someone nearly 60 years old. Like Gao Yang, Morgan had endured an extremely tense escape and a long flight to get here. Yet, while Gao Yang still seemed listless, Morgan appeared lively and spirited. Gao Yang sat down opposite Morgan. Once Gao Yang was seated, Morgan took out a stack of cash, placed it on the table, then pushed it towards Gao Yang with a smile.
Here's $6,000. I still owe you $94,000. I apologize for not having much cash on hand. Obviously, you can't accept checks or transfers. But rest assured, once you're back home, just give me a call and I'll transfer the rest to your account, including any fees.
Gao Yang looked somewhat dazed at the stack of cash on the table and said to Morgan,
Mr. Morgan, I don't understand what you mean.
Morgan, spreading his hands.
I promised you $100,000 if you got me to Malakal. I'm a man of my word. You did your part, now it's time for me to honor my promise.
Only then did Gao Yang recall Morgan's previous promise, which he hadn't taken seriously at the time. But now Morgan was indeed ready to fulfill it. After thinking for a moment, Gao Yang pocketed the money on the table and said earnestly,
This is enough, Mr. Morgan. I never intended to take your money. Well, I do need money right now, so I'll accept this much. But let's forget the rest, all right? I haven't done much. If it weren't for you, Professor Bark and I wouldn't have reached Malakal, and you also took me out of Sudan. So I think we're even now.
Morgan shaking his head.
I admire your attitude towards money, Gao, but not your attitude towards business. Friendships aside, business is business. I offered to hire you, and you didn't object. We completed the deal when we arrived at Malakal, so paying you is only natural. We must have a sense of contract. Maybe you think saving a stranger from a gunman isn't worth much, but to me, you saved mine and Bob's lives. In a sense, $100,000 seems a little less, but again, let's keep business and personal matters separate. Take the money, and then you'll owe me a favor.
Hearing Morgan's words, Gao Yang nodded.
Well, Mr. Morgan, I can only thank you for your generosity.
Morgan, waving his hand with a hearty laugh.
All right, young man, Benghazi isn't a big city, not a glamorous one either, but for someone who's been on the plains for 3 years, you must want to take a stroll. Go on, buy some clothes, find some amusement, but most importantly, find a good restaurant to eat. Aren't you starving? It's a shame. I would have liked to treat you to your first big meal back in civilization, but unfortunately, I have to go out immediately.
While Morgan spoke, Bob made faces on the side.
Hey, brother, you've got a lot of cash now. Don't you want to take me out for some fun?
Gao Yang laughed, stood up, and shook Morgan's hand. Then, turning to Bob, he said,
Let's go. Whatever you want to do, it's on me.
The hotel lobby offered currency exchange services. After exchanging some dollars for dinars, Gao Yang and Bob left the hotel and strolled through Benghazi's bustling district. Gao Yang felt as if he had passed through to another world. Observing the busy streets, Gao Yang couldn't help but remark,
I always thought I'd never make it back.
Bob shrugging.
Don't overthink. What you should do now is celebrate. But first, you need to change your clothes and shoes. You look quite ridiculous at the moment.
Feeling a bit cold, Gao Yang agreed with Bob. They found a mall and bought clothes from inside out. Gao Yang didn't get new shoes, though. He opted for jeans specifically to match his boots. Refreshed, Gao Yang and Bob discussed where to go next. They both agreed on getting a meal and a drink, but the specifics proved difficult. With stores and restaurants lining the streets, neither knew where to go. At that moment, Bob suggested,
I've got a great idea. How about we get some Chinese food?
That's perfect, but is there a Chinese restaurant around here? We haven't spotted any on our way.
Bob looked around, checked his watch, and said,
This is my first time abroad. I want to explore the area. It's still early, why don't we walk and look?
Gao Yang had no objections, so they meandered along. Eventually, they reached a quiet street where the crowd had thinned out considerably. Said Gao Yang, remembering something.
Hey, Bob, your father mentioned that the situation in Libya is a bit unstable and advised us not to wander too far.
Bob, indifferently.
You saw how it is. Does this look unstable to you? Would you go shopping before a battle? The number of people in the mall tells me everything is fine.
As soon as Bob's words fell, a huge crowd suddenly surged onto the deserted street, with more people emerging from the alleys and houses to join in, carrying flags and loudly chanting slogans, looking very angry as they moved in a uniform direction. Stunned, both Gao Yang and Bob exclaimed in unison, "Damn."
I take back what I said. Something's gone wrong. We need to get out of here.
Gao Yang pulled Bob back a few steps and whispered,
Keep it down. Let them pass, then we go the opposite way. You don't want to go where they're heading, right? When we get to a less crowded place, we'll rush back to the hotel.
Bob nodded and whispered back,
Bad luck. We'll have to wait for them to go by again.
Gao Yang and Bob stood still against the wall, under the watchful eyes of many, hoping not to attract the attention of the understandably agitated crowd. Gao Yang might have been slightly safer, but Bob's blonde hair was too conspicuous, clearly indicating he was a Westerner. Fortunately, while they drew attention, no one approached or accosted them. When the street finally cleared again, Gao Yang wiped the sweat from his brow and said,
Let's hurry! Go!
They ran in the opposite direction from the crowd for a long time. Along the way, they encountered crowds 4 more times, each narrowly missing them. Frustratingly, these gatherings seemed headed in different directions, so Gao Yang was unsure where to safely go. Worst of all, they were lost. Roaming through Benghazi streets, they couldn't tell where they were, and with the ongoing widespread gatherings, hailing a taxi was impossible. After encountering yet another group of about 100 people, Gao Yang tugged on Bob's shirt and whispered,
Follow them, or we'll never get out of here.
Although it felt risky, Bob had no better plan, so they followed the group at a distance, aiming to reach the main street. It wasn't long before Gao Yang realized his suggestion wasn't the best. The group they followed grew larger, and looking back, he was shocked to see even more people joining in from behind. They were now part of a much larger group. Gao Yang pulled Bob's sleeve and, after mouthing a direction, they started edging towards the periphery of the crowd. As they reached the crowd's edge, they also emerged from the maze-like alleys and onto a wide avenue. But by then, the road was already filled with the angry mass. Back on the main road, Gao Yang yanked Bob, and they started jogging. At this point, they didn't care about directions, they just wanted to get away. Trying not to attract attention, they walked carefully along the roadside and, after covering a fair distance and reaching the outer edge of the crowd, were about to leave when Bob suddenly pulled Gao Yang to a halt. Gao Yang hurried,
What's the matter? Let's go!
As Gao Yang questioned him in haste, Bob's face turned pale, and pulling hard on Gao Yang, he said softly,
Look behind you, there's a Chinese restaurant.
Gao Yang, both angry and anxious.
You can't still be thinking of eating now, can you?
Next to the restaurant entrance, there are 2 people pulling out guns. What do we do?
Gao Yang slowly turned around, following Bob's gaze to see next to a large door adorned with lanterns and decor that decidedly carried a Chinese flair, neatly trimmed bushes reminiscent of common Chinese evergreens. However, behind the bushes, with the movement of shadows, 2 dark muzzles were slowly extended. Gao Yang was only about 20 meters away from the restaurant when he realized there were no side streets or alleys nearby where he could hide. The restaurant was at an intersection next to a small street. Taking a deep breath, Gao Yang whispered,
We can't stay here. If they start shooting, it'll be chaos. They seem to be waiting for something. Let's pretend we didn't see anything and just walk past them into the alley.
After he said this, he overcame his fear and walked toward the 2 gun muzzles, looking back after a couple of steps to see Bob following him, his head lowered and seemingly trembling. Gao Yang tried to act nonchalant as he and Bob got closer to the Chinese restaurant. When they were only about 4 or 5 meters away from the hidden gunman, thankfully, the gunman did not open fire. When they reached the street corner, Gao Yang wasn't sure whether to keep going straight and quickly past the gunman's hiding place or turn into the alley. Seeing several people on the main street peering curiously at the crowd, Gao Yang decided he'd rather spend the whole day in the alley than be a sitting duck in the street or be trampled into a pulp by a panicked mob. Suppressing fear in his heart, Gao Yang turned the corner into the narrower street, and Bob followed. The Bob was so tense he could barely move. Gao Yang had to grab Bob's arm and hurry forward. Gao Yang's heart pounded in his chest, and after walking a dozen meters, the fear of being exposed under the gunman's aim made it impossible to keep calm. When he saw that no one was following, Gao Yang whispered,
Run.
Bob, his head still down and his body trembling, didn't respond to Gao Yang's words. Out of necessity, Gao Yang tugged Bob's arm, and they both started to sprint. Bob was nearly pulled to the ground by Gao Yang's sudden rush, but after regaining his footing, Bob reacted and started to run hard. They hadn't gone far when a gunshot erupted from behind them, followed by a barrage of gunfire. At least a dozen guns must have fired to create such a volley. Hearing the shots, Gao Yang and Bob quickened their pace, running desperately along the buildings lining the street. Just then, Gao Yang noticed splinters of cement and brick bursting from the wall next to him, pockmarking it with holes. At that moment, Bob, running beside Gao Yang, suddenly fell to the ground. Seeing Bob fall, Gao Yang didn't have much time to think. He stopped and started to drag Bob by his arm.
I've been shot!
Bob screamed, then began to crawl with his hands and feet, coordinating with Gao Yang to pick up speed. At that moment, Gao Yang saw a shop entrance behind them. Using all his strength, he dragged Bob a few steps forward, intending to take shelter inside. When Gao Yang got to the entrance while dragging Bob, he encountered a South Asian man holding an axe, who looked at them in panic. Gao Yang shouted,
Help me! Pull him inside!
The South Asian man shook his head in fear, and then he attempted to close the shop door. Desperate, Gao Yang pushed against the door and yelled,
Let us in! They're shooting outside! Do you want to watch us die?
Gao Yang was truly desperate. If the South Asian man didn't let them in, he was ready to force their way through. Already, he could hear the frightened shouts and disordered footsteps of people on the street, and the gunfire was getting more intense. One saving grace was that the shop's door extended outward, so Gao Yang and Bob were now under the protection of the brick wall. For the moment, they didn't have to worry about being shot. But if they couldn't take refuge inside the shop, Gao Yang didn't want to think about what might happen next. Just as he was about to seize the axe to force his way in, the South Asian man suddenly uttered a few words.
Are you from China?
Puzzled for a moment, Gao Yang then loudly declared,
Yes, I'm Chinese. Let us in quickly.
Upon hearing that Gao Yang was Chinese, the man dropped his axe and opened the wooden door, grabbing one of Bob's arms and helping Gao Yang drag Bob inside the shop. Once inside, the South Asian man immediately said,
Lend me a hand.
Together, they lowered a metal shutter from the outside and locked the wooden door behind them, then breathed a sigh of relief. With the shop properly sealed, Gao Yang rushed over to Bob, who was sitting on the ground.
Where were you shot? Let me see.
A bit embarrassed, Bob pointed to his knee.
It seems like I wasn't shot after all. Look, there's no blood. But it hurt a lot earlier, so I thought I was.
Gao Yang examined the spot and saw a dust mark on Bob's knee. He exhaled deeply and slapped Bob's knee.
You damn fool, you scared me to death. It was just a piece of debris that hit you.
Sorry, but it really hurt. In that situation, of course, I thought I'd been shot.
Relieved that Bob was not actually shot but merely hit by debris, Gao Yang finally relaxed, sitting down and gasping for breath. They weren't completely out of danger, but at least they were momentarily safe. The South Asian man, I'm sorry for how I treated you earlier, but these are sensitive times, and foreigners are incredibly dangerous, so I had to be careful. I apologize. The man stood by the door with the axe, nervously speaking to Gao Yang. Gao Yang got up and nodded his thanks.
Are you really Chinese? Say something in your language.
And I how, hello.
Hearing Gao Yang's greeting in Chinese, the man smiled.
You're Chinese, so I let you in. I've learned a few simple phrases. Hello, goodbye, things like that. I know a Chinese friend who owns a restaurant at the street corner. Did you see which one earlier? Foreigners are very dangerous now, extremely dangerous. People say Gaddafi has hired many mercenaries. We must keep far away from them. But being Chinese is different, of course.
Gao Yang was curious.
Why? Why is it okay for Chinese people?
The man put down his axe, extended his hand with a smile.
I'm Pakistani, friend.
Gao Yang suddenly realized, grabbed the man's hand with a firm shake.
I see. Thank you very much for your help, friend.
My name is Malik, from Karachi. It's great to meet you here, friend. But we'll have to wait before we can chat. I need to close the windows, it's too dangerous like this.
After a brief exchange, Malik took up his axe again and peered outside from the shop window. Gao Yang joined him at the window. Just then, he saw someone step out of the opposite shop and look around the street.
Get inside. Do you want to be shot?
Both Gao Yang and Malik shouted at the same time, Gao Yang in English, Malik in Arabic. But just as they had called out, the person looking around burst into a cloud of blood and collapsed onto the ground. As the person on the street lay there, Gao Yang and Malik watched as two men with guns ran over. One of them stopped next to the victim, aimed at their head, and fired. Brain matter splashed against the front window of the store where Gao Yang was hiding, sliding down the glass and leaving a white trail. Gao Yang and Malik exchanged horrified glances and immediately ducked behind the wall next to the window, followed by the sound of a gunshot, shattering the glass to pieces. Malik, standing by the broken window with an axe in hand, and Gao Yang saw that their hiding place was a tool shop, filled with all sorts of hardware and power tools. Without hesitation, Gao Yang grabbed two long-handled axes from the shelf. Bob had also stood up and armed himself with a long steel crowbar, positioning himself behind Gao Yang. Gao Yang tossed one of the axes to Malik, who then placed his smaller one on the windowsill. The three men now stood their ground, ready to strike anyone trying to crawl in through the broken window. Gao Yang had seen clearly the shooter was a young African man, not more than 15, yet his actions were cruel, shooting in the head someone who already posed no threat. Gao Yang was determined not to let such a person into the shop. Luckily, the gunman seemed to have no interest in entering their shop. After firing several shots into the window, he ran off in haste. After the footsteps faded, Malik whispered,
We need to find a way to block the window. Damn, I should have installed protective netting on it long ago.
The shop was well equipped with tools, and they found materials to barricade the window. Soon, the window was covered with wooden boards and iron rods. There were still gaps, but nobody could break in now. As they secured the window, more panicked people flooded the street outside, but thankfully, no one tried to storm the shop. After the crowd passed, the gunfire never entirely ceased, some shots echoing dangerously close. Gao Yang and the others listened anxiously to the sounds outside. When the street quieted down and Gao Yang thought they might be safe, sudden gunshots rang out at the door. Bullets ripped through the metal shutter and splintered the wooden door from the inside.